So, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining in tonight. We're looking at another one of the parables of Jesus. If you are on Facebook or YouTube, you can send me a text, a message, and I'll try to respond to that. I try to check that as much as I can. And again, if you know my cell phone number, you can send me a text. I can't check email while I'm doing this, but a text or something in the chat box on Facebook or YouTube, and try to reach me that way. I've been thinking about maybe changing this to some type of Zoom format to see if I could get more interaction. But to be honest with you, I'm really haven't figured out exactly how I would do that, if I'm smart enough to do that, or even if I have the right kind of technology to do that. But it's something I might look at in the future to see if we can do a few things that are maybe a little bit different, or something we could do that could get a little bit more interaction in what we're doing. So tonight we are going to be looking at the parable of the tares and the wheat. And it's really great. It's a great study, I think. There are some questions that when I read through the parable, Jesus brings a couple of things up, and I really wish he had kind of expounded on those, but they're not really the heart of the parable. So he doesn't talk about it, and so we'll talk about those when we get there. Since he didn't really explain it, then I definitely can't explain it if Jesus doesn't explain it. So again, it's one of the parables, the tares and the wheat, where it's explained by Jesus himself, which makes it, a couple of the parables Jesus gives the explanation to, and this is one of them. So first we'll just go to the text. We'll look at the parable, we'll read the parable, and then we will read Jesus' explanation of the parable, which I have to be honest with you, I really love the parables where Jesus gives the explanation. I mean, we can go off and talk about some other things and maybe explore some things that's in the parable, but when Jesus explains the parable, then you know that you're getting the very heart of the parable and what he was trying to say. So this is Matthew chapter 13. We're just going to read this parable in Matthew. We're going to start with verse 24, which is up here on the left side of the screen. If you want to follow along with me, or maybe you have a Bible, you can just read in your own Bible, and but I want to make sure I had it on the screen in case you needed to see it. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. And when the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. And the owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it into my barns." And so then he tells a couple of other parables. And we go later in chapter 13. And I want to read verse 34 here before we get to the explanation. Jesus spoke all of these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet, "I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world." Then he left the crowd and went into the house. And his disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. And they will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear." So as you look at the parable, he gives us all of the key players, and I kind of listed these out for you. The owner of the field, the one who sowed the field and owns the field, that's Jesus. That is the Son of Man. We understand that to be Jesus. It's a title that Jesus often used in reference to himself. The wheat are sons of the kingdom. That's the good seed. The enemy is the devil. The tares are the sons of evil, or the sons of the evil one, and it can be translated two different ways. I was reading from the from New International Version, and if you look at the New International Version, it says here. Let me find it real quick. Sorry, I think I went to the wrong spot. But anyway, when you look at that evil. I wanted to show you where that was, but it's in the explanation here. And the enemy who sows them is the weeds are, here we go. The weeds are the sons of the evil one. So that can be translated sons of evil or sons of the evil one. It's you see the same type of phraseology used in the Lord's Prayer, where is it deliver us from evil or deliver us from the evil one. And it doesn't change it a lot, but you'll see different translations do it different ways. Probably here, I think probably it means more sons of evil instead of just sons of the evil one. But again, it doesn't make a lot of difference in that. So, but if you go back to the explanation, then the field is the world, and the harvest is the completion of the ages or the end of the ages. And it's a very unique kind of parable in that the field is the world in this parable. So you start looking into the parable, and there's just some questions that come along. You know, when he uses that idea of tares and wheat, I wanted to pull a couple of pictures up from it. Now, I didn't do anything great here. I just did an internet search, okay? And I did an internet search, and I just put in tares and wheat, and the tare is what's called the weed in this parable is a tare, a darnel. It's called actually the bearded darnel, which if my research is right, when you eat it can actually make you sick. But here are kind of pictures like here's wheat before it's fully ripe, and here's what a tare looks like. They look really, really similar. Or here you have the wheat and the tares. And again, I'm just wanted you to see the similarity of how they look. And again, I didn't create any of this. I'm just using what's on Google, right? Here's wheat and tares. Here is a tare and wheat. Here they are growing together, where you kind of see how difficult it is to tell the two apart. In fact, to be very honest with you, I'm not really sure which one is which. I know one is wheat and one is a darnel or a tare. But when Jesus uses that type of terminology, it's fairly similar to some other things that Jesus does when he uses this comparison between things that are good and things that are evil. I mean, in other times, Jesus used sheep and wolves, or he used grapes and thorns. He used figs and thistles, a good tree, a bad tree, good fruit, bad fruit, light and darkness. So it's just the comparison that Jesus is making, where he makes it in a lot of places in the gospel. But one of the keys here is the wheat and the tares grow together. I mean, they grow up in the same field. When they're immature, when they're just first planted, first sprouting, evidently it's very, very difficult to tell the two apart. It's only that they start to come to maturity and they start to bear fruit that you can really tell which one is a tare and which one is a weed. And a tare has a pretty intricate type of root system. So if you were to go in and try to uproot all of the tares, uproot all of the weeds, then there's a good chance that you're going to pull some weeds up with it. And when Jesus does the explanation of the parable, Jesus' explanation of the parable focuses on judgment, not the existence of evil. I mean, when I read this parable, one thing that I go back and I mean, this is just me thinking out loud, but when I go back and I say, man, if there's something I really wish Jesus would have addressed, it's this idea that they're both going to exist together, because if I tear out if I remove the tares, if I rip those up, there's a good chance that I'll rip up the wheat. And so when I read the parable, I think, man, Jesus, why don't you really talk about why you leave tares in the field, the evil with the wheat, and how when you rip up the tare, it would destroy the wheat. And you want to go into that, but that's not the point of what Jesus is trying to say. He says they exist together, but the real focus is on the judgment. It's not on the fact that they exist together. And so that's where we're going to kind of talk about then how are we supposed to understand this parable? What's the message we're supposed to get out of it? And this cleansing of the kingdom occurs at judgment. There will be this time at judgment where God sends the angels, the earth is harvested, much like Jesus does in many other parables. And when that happens, the weeds, the sons of evil are going to be, they're going to be destroyed, sent to punishment. And those who are sons of the kingdom, the wheat, they're going to be gathered up and put in the barn, or they're going to shine like they're shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. So they're going to receive this righteousness. So when I sit down and I look at the parable from that perspective, and as much as I want to go into, this is why I think that God doesn't remove evil from the world, Jesus doesn't explain that. He just explains, he just tells us that they're going to exist in the world together. And so as I go through and I think about that, this is the question that kind of comes to my mind. Then what does the church, what do the sons of the kingdom do with the weeds? What does the church do with unbelievers? And these aren't necessarily just unbelievers. They're people that have rejected the kingdom. But what does the church do with people who are rejecting the kingdom? How do we fit in? How do we fit into this parable? Because we're not evidently supposed to take all of the weeds out of the world, because Jesus says, well, you can't do that without destroying some of the good seed. So it's going to exist together, at least for a period of time. So I guess the first point is, at least for me, is really, got a lot of notes written down here, but it's really kind of a simple kind of statement. When you look at the parable, the wheat doesn't remove the tares from the field. That's not what we are supposed to be about. That's not our job. Our job is not to take all of the evil out of the world. We can't. We don't have the ability to do that. That the owner of the field, the Son of Man, will send the angels, and the angels who are going to come, they will take care of the harvest. We're not taking care of the harvest. We're wheat that's growing up in a field that also has tares in it. And the message for us is we're going to have to exist in a world with evil. We grow up in that together. We mature in that together. And so it's really interesting that the wheat and the tares can only be distinguished at maturity. It's only after it's become a mature plant that you can tell the difference between the two. And as the church, then we don't remove the evil. And then that makes me think about, if you just look at text and you think about how people have come to the message of Jesus, or how they've accepted the message of Jesus, or even if you looked at different areas in their life before they come to maturity, you might not really be able to tell if they're good seed or bad seed, if they're wheat or tares. And maybe there's even someone in your own life that you have seen that at one point in your life you would have said, hey, that's wheat. I am sure that is wheat. But then at maturity, it really ended up being a tare, a weed. Or someone in life that you thought, man, that's a weed. I mean, that is not a believer in Jesus. That's not a son of the kingdom. That's a weed. That's a tare. And then you look at them later in life, and you look and you think, you know what? They were wheat. They weren't a tare at all. And we have such limited judgment, and we have such limited ability to see that because we're not God, and we're not the one that judges. We're not the one who's in control of the harvest. That I think we have to be patient, not only with ourselves but with others, and say, okay, then how does that kind of play out in life? What does that look like? And here's just a couple of examples, right? So if you think about Paul, who was also called Saul, and then you go over to the text and you look at Acts chapter 9. Meanwhile, Saul was breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. And as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. And so if you were to look at Saul early in life, you would think, man, that has to be a tare, right? Because he's breathing out murderous threats against God. He's taking believers in Jesus, and he's putting them in prison. In the chapter just before that, in Acts in Acts chapter 7, 2 chapters before that, when they stoned Stephen, Saul was there giving approval to his death. And so if you look at him early in life, if you look at Saul, you would think, man, he's definitely a tare, right? But he ended up being one of God's greatest apostles. I mean, he ended up being wheat. And so for us, sometimes when we see people in life, it's hard for us to distinguish which one they would be. If you looked at Peter early in life, he's presumptuous. He follows Jesus, so or if you look at Judas and you think, okay, Judas traveled with Jesus for 3 years, and he was a disciple, and he was one of the 12, and he kept the money bag. And if just from outward appearances, you would think, man, that's really got to be wheat. He has to be a son of the kingdom. But at the end, he wasn't a son of the kingdom. He was a tare. Or John Mark. You remember John Mark traveled with Paul and Barnabas, and he went with them on a missionary journey, and they get to Perga in Pamphylia in Acts chapter 13, and John left them to return to Jerusalem. And then after that, in chapter 15, there is the council at Jerusalem. Then they decide, Paul and Barnabas decide to go back and visit the brothers where they preached. And Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. And they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So if you look at that, at least from Paul's perspective at that time, it seems like, well, maybe Mark's a tare. Maybe he's not wheat. But he ended up being wheat. He ended up being a great disciple of God. So if you look at the other side, I'm just grabbing some examples from the New Testament. I thought Demas, one of the things it said about Demas is that he loved the world, and so he was one of Paul's traveling companions. He was with him. He was a fellow worker, but late in life, where early he probably would have looked like wheat, but later in life he ended up being a tare. Ananias and Sapphira, they were members of the church in Acts, and Barnabas sold a field and brought some money and laid it at the apostles' feet. They did the same thing, but you remember Ananias and Sapphira, and the text says they could have kept some of the money for themselves. That would have been perfectly fine. The problem was not that they kept money. The problem was they lied about it. They presented themselves as doing the same thing Barnabas had done, which was sold a field and brought it and took the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. they tried to make it look like they did that, but they kept back part of the money while telling everybody they gave all of the money. So it wasn't that they kept the money. The problem was the lie. And they were both killed. You know, you look at the church and somebody sells a field and they bring the money and they give it to the apostles. You think, okay, that's wheat, but it really wasn't. It was tares. Or in Matthew chapter 7, you know, when Jesus says, you know, many will, they, did we not prophesy in your name and do miracles and cast out demons? And Jesus said, I never knew you. And so on the outside, even with the things they were doing for the kingdom, they looked like wheat, but they weren't wheat. They were tares. And the only thing I'm trying to illustrate with that is, as we go through life, sometimes we can't tell the difference. I mean, it's like the wheat and the tares that are growing up together, and it's hard for us to distinguish, and it's not our place to judge. Now, he's not talking about church discipline in this parable. You know, there are issues that happen in the church. We maintain the integrity and the purity of the church. You know, you see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Totally different study. We'll do that sometime. But the field here, the field is the world. So as we live in the world, we are going to coexist with evil if we are sons of the kingdom. Now, there's another kind of thing about the tare is, and I don't know, this is not, I'm trying not to make some great big theological statement, but at one time we were all tares. You know, we became sons of the kingdom, and you know, and I think if you realize that, there's some compassion and some grace and some mercy that goes with that. So if we are going to exist in a world which evil also exists, and I think that's the point of the parable. Jesus has taught. You know, we did the parable of the soils. There are four kind of soils. There's the path, and the rocky, and the thorny, and the good. And I think as Jesus teaches that, he is teaching that in the context of people that he knew were rejecting his message. They were rejecting the fact that he was the Messiah. Here, it's a very similar parable. We live in a world where everyone is not going to be a believer in Jesus. And Jesus, he's not going to come and rip the kingdom apart, because in doing that, in some way, he might destroy some of the wheat. So what's going to happen in the field, which is the world, is we are going to coexist in the world with evil as long as there's a world. And so I think the first lesson that we learn from that is we be perceptive of the enemy. We be perceptive of the things that are happening. You know, the devil is active. Evil is active. I don't turn my head and act like it doesn't exist. I recognize that it exists. I recognize that the world is not going to have the same values, hopefully, that I have as a believer in Jesus. I know that the world is going to take different ethical stands than I take, and I oppose those, and I speak out against those, but I know that they're going to exist in the world because the enemy has come into the world, and God is fully in control, but he allows the enemy to exist. And as long as the enemy exists, the enemy is going to do everything he can to try to draw people away from having faith in God. So they're going to have different ethics than I have. They have different morals than I have. They view the world differently than I view the world. Some of the things that they see in the world, and they say, well, that's just the way the world works. I look at the world and say, no, those are things that are sin, that were created, that are the result of Satan, and the way that he tempts people, and the way that he tries to manipulate the things that are in the world. So when I look at the world, or I read the news, or I listen to a moral statement or an ethical statement that the world might take, I know that in many ways it's going to be contradictory to what I believe. You know, the world believes, at least part of the world believes one thing about abortion. I believe another. The world, a portion of that believes a certain thing about sexual issues, yet I believe something else. And I coexist in a world where evil exists. So I recognize that, and I'm perceptive of it. But recognizing it and being perceptive of it, I also I treat people with compassion, or I should. I hope that I treat people with compassion. I try to treat people with compassion. Even how about people that that don't agree with me? Will you still treat them with compassion and love? That doesn't mean you agree with them, but you treat them with compassion and love. You realize that some people in the world are blinded by Satan. And what you hope from that, I mean, you're wheat in a field, and it has weeds in it. And so my responsibility in that world as a son of the kingdom is we proclaim the gospel. And so when you look at the field, and he says, okay, here's a field, and it's good seed was sowed in it, but also there's some weeds in it that were sown by the enemy, and they're going to grow up together, and they're going to coexist together until time comes for God to harvest the field. And I don't know when he's going to harvest. And so you get down to really kind of the ethical statement, and we'll get to that in a second. But it reminds me of this passage in Second Peter where the Lord's not slow in keeping his promise. He's patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. So as we live in that world, our job is to proclaim the gospel, to try to get the message of Jesus to as many people as we can get the message of Jesus to. So we're the way Jesus and God is patient with us, we should be patient with other people, is what I'm trying to say. So the church must exist in an evil world. So how do we make the best of it? And the way that we make the best of it is we do what we can to proclaim the gospel, understanding that there are going to be weeds in the field, and there's going to be wheat in the field. And in some cases, no matter what we do or what we say or how we say it or how much we try, or even how much we want it to be different, there are people who they're not going to accept the gospel. They're not going to accept Jesus as the Son of God. Those are the weeds that are in the field. Those are the sons of the evil one, or the sons of evil. And I think in Jesus' parable, as he looks at the world as a whole, he's not talking about people who, I think he's talking about people who have rejected the gospel, who have rejected who he is. Much like just in his day, I mean, just imagine Jesus is walking on earth. He's doing miracles right in front of people. I mean, he is doing incredible miracles, and people are looking at it with their own eyes, and they're looking at him and saying, but you're not the Son of God. We are not going to accept you as the Christ. We are not going to believe in you. No matter what you do, we are just not going to believe. And in this parable, there are people in the world who are like that, and we exist in that world. So as you kind of wade through that parable, I think you get to one really kind of important question, and we're doing good on time, almost through. So, am I a child of the kingdom or a child of evil? Now, as much as we might want to stop in that parable and say, okay, this is why evil exists in the world, because in the parable, you can't take out the weeds without destroying the wheat. And we might launch into an explanation of that. But in the parable itself, when you go back and look at that, Jesus did not launch into an explanation of that. He didn't launch into an explanation of why I can't take out the weeds because of the wheat. The explanation that Jesus launched into was starting in verse 40. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. And I think this is really interesting. I don't want to make a big deal of it, but I think it's really interesting. They will weed out of his kingdom. I mean, the field, that is the world, belongs completely to him. It is his field. It's not like the enemy owns any of that field. That is the Son of Man's field. And so at the end, when he sends his angels, when they will weed out of his kingdom, even if they don't accept him, they're still under the rule of his kingdom. And he will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. and they will throw them into the fiery furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. So as much as we might want to jump in and explain, well, this is why God leaves the weeds with the wheat. As much as we might want to explain that, that is not the emphasis that Jesus has when he explains the parable. When he explains the parable, it's about judgment. And when the judgment comes, when he comes, when he sends the angels, when he sends the harvesters, when he removes the weeds from the field and the wheat shines like the sun, are you a child of the kingdom or a child of the devil? And I think in this parable, in the context, I think Jesus is calling those who hear the parable to ask themselves, am I a son of the kingdom? Am I a follower of the Son of Man? Am I a follower of the Messiah? And Jesus was saying that is the Messiah. I am the Messiah. I don't know what's really happening with some of this. I got one screen here that says that it cannot play the video, so I don't know if it was actually playing that video or not. So hopefully it's still there. It looks like it's there on the other two. So I hope you enjoyed looking at the parable of the weeds. I guess I call it the parable of the wheat and the tares. This is the New International Version. It has the parable of the weeds. Again, remember, they don't all have a specific Jesus-given title. It's the title that we put on them so we could understand them. But, as you live in the world, shine like a son of the kingdom. That's all I'm asking. Be a child of the kingdom. So next week, we'll look at another parable. If you want to join in on Sunday morning, ClarksvilleHighwayChurch.com or GospelChariot.church, you can catch the live stream there. Clarksville Highway Church of Christ is a Facebook page. Gospel Chariot is a Facebook page. Or the YouTube page, if you start looking for that on its own, is Gospel Chariot. We will live stream Bible class at 9 o'clock. I will be talking about Jesus is a better king as we continue that study. And then on Sunday morning, we are going to be looking at some lessons from Moses as he's called to lead the Israelites out of the land of Egypt at the beginning of his calling while he's in the wilderness, kind of looking at Moses' first 80 years of his life. Looking forward to that. So please tune in and join on Sunday. I know if you try to do that, I know a couple of Sundays we have had some live stream issues, and that is from our provider. And so hopefully those will not be present Sunday, but we have very little control over the issues that we've been having the last little bit. So thanks for joining tonight. Still trying to keep these to 30 minutes. Some of them will be a little longer, but really trying hard to get to keep it at a 30-minute class. So let me see if there are any comments that I see. No comments there. The sad thing is that a tare cannot turn into wheat. That's very true. And it's really, a tare can't turn into wheat because of the way that the parable is structured, because he's only talking about those who are either tares or wheat at the culmination, at the end of the age. And so at the end of the age, if you're a tare, you're a tare, and if you're wheat, you're wheat. You can't change then. I just think the interesting thing is, from our perspective, I think just too many times we have to be careful that we don't label someone as either tare or wheat, and not be open to the way that God can work in their lives, because God sent his son into the world to change lives and to change people. And we always must be open to the way that God can change the lives of people and change who they are. But at the end of the age, that comment is so true. You're at the end of the age when Jesus sends the harvesters, the angels, you're either tare or wheat. So if you go back to the slide we had just a second, please ask yourself this question: am I a child of the kingdom, or a child of evil. Hey, again, thanks for joining, and look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much.